And perhaps we can begin. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon from sunny Brussels. It is a pleasure to be joined here today by Benjamin Smith, Glenda Gray, Mateusz Falsao, and of course Rachel Cohen in different parts of the world to have a very timely discussion. Thanks to the MSF Access campaign. Actually, thank you for bringing us together to foster this very timely discussion in light of the upcoming World Health Assembly. To discuss how can disclosing clinical trial costs can contribute to increasing access to medical products. My name is Yannis Natsis. I'm the director of the European Social Insurance Platform, ESIP. ESIP is the European umbrella organization that brings together, essentially for the purpose of this discussion, to keep it simple, the payers, the organizations that are actually paying for the social protection and social security in Europe. And of course, we cover areas beyond healthcare, but also healthcare and access to medicines. And it is a pleasure because that is also an issue that is close to our heart as we are striving for better, but also affordable medicines in Europe and beyond. And I can tell you from my perspective here in Brussels, these are topics on the top of the political agenda, especially in light of the pandemic. And the European Union is looking at these issues, including the revising or the prospect of revising the European pharmaceutical legislation. Just to say that this cannot come at a better time. And I'm sure that we will have a very interesting discussion. We will be able to have Q&A with you in the Q&A chat room. Obviously, you can see that this meeting is recorded and will be made available online later on. You can, of course, go on Twitter and you can engage using the hashtag clinical trial, let me get it right, clinical trial resolution. So I repeat, the hashtag is clinical trial resolution. Perhaps my colleagues can also remind people in the chat. We will have a short introduction by our hosts, obviously, Sydney Wong, the co-executive director of the MSF Access campaign. Good to see you, Sid. And then we will proceed with presentations from our distinguished speakers. We've already shared some questions with them in order to tease them, to provoke them. And then we will continue, obviously, with the Q&A with the audience. And please go ahead, start thinking of your questions and make sure that you include them in writing in the Q&A chat function. So let's not waste any time. Please, over to you, Sid. Can you explain why are we here today and what motivated you in organizing this very timely discussion?
Great, thanks, Yannis, and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the roundtable discussion today. I'm going to just briefly set the scene as Yannis has asked, and say a few words in terms of why we think this is a relevant discussion now. I think as MSF, over the years, we've seen how high prices for medical products consistently hinder access. High prices are often justified by the pharmaceutical industry by claims that it costs billions in research and development costs to bring them to market. And critically, the clinical trials aspect is widely regarded as the most expensive part of that process. However, companies don't routinely disclose how much they spend on R&D, including the cost of clinical trials, and even when the funding comes directly from the public sector. Nor are there many studies that actually really examine these costs. And I think in absence of good standardized information, what we see is significant differences between cost estimates. And depending on who actually does the study and conducts the research, estimates widely range from $250 million US all the way up to billions of US dollars invested in research. As such, we don't have a clear picture of what R&D, including clinical trials, actually cost, and how these costs importantly influence and translate into the prices that we see for the medical products. Despite this, huge amounts of public funding are routinely invested in R&D. We saw that with COVID-19 medical tools, and yet the costs of the R&D and the clinical trials and the money used to fund this, it's not made public, and it's not disaggregated, and it's not accessible. I think making clinical trial costs public would help determine, the true cost of late-stage clinical research, would facilitate appropriate R&D investments, and would enable governments and treatment providers to regulate and negotiate prices more effectively. And as we start to learn the lessons from the COVID pandemic, and there are a number of good initiatives which aim to better prepare us for these global health challenges. One of this is indeed the resolution that Yanis mentioned on clinical trials, and it's going to be tabled at the World Health Assembly next week by UK and Argentina. Whilst this initiative aims to strengthen the coordination of clinical trials, trying to avoid duplication and encouraging timely publication of data, draft so far misses the opportunity to mandate reporting of clinical trial costs, particularly for when the funding comes directly from the public sector. The 2019 WHO Transparency Resolution urged member states to take steps to enhance dissemination and access to the costs of clinical trials. And to build on this precedent, we're hosting this roundtable today prior to the WHO to discuss the importance of disclosing costs for clinical trials, and particularly the opportunity to make sure that this is reflected in the resolution that will be discussed next week at the WHO. In addition to that, it's also encouraging to see that legislation is beginning to emerge in a number of different countries. And today, I'm looking forward to hearing of two examples, one from the US and one from Brazil, but also hearing what others who have experience in collecting and disclosing R&D costs. So we're hoping for a very lively discussion today. It's a very timely and important discussion, but we also hope to continue this conversation with many of you during and also beyond the World Health Assembly. So handing back to Yanis and looking forward to a good discussion.
Thank you very much, Sid, and thank you for actually also drawing this common thread that started already in 2019 with the WHO Transparency Resolution at the time. And of course, clinical trials transparency and the transparency in the question of the cost of those clinical trials is included in that resolution. And of course, it's good to see with the discussions next week at the WHO that there is still the political momentum to get it right, and hopefully we will be able to get it right. So Sid already mentioned an example, a promising example coming from the US, and it's a pleasure to be joined by Benjamin Smith. Good morning, Ben. Ben Smith, he is the Chief Health Counsel with the US House of Representatives in the Committee on Oversight and Reform. And Ben, could you please explain to us what's going on there with the Pharmaceutical Research Transparency Act? Where did this idea come from? Where are we with it? And how optimistic are you as to how far it can go?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. And
we have an issue with your sound.
You can hear me. I'm audible, I hope.
Now my head, please.
How is it
video
now?
Sometimes if you lose the video, you have more bandwidth.
Am I okay now for audio? Okay. Better now? Okay. Thank you. Sorry, I will go without video, which I'm sure will improve everybody's day immensely. So yeah, so thank you, Yanis, and Sydney. I appreciate it, and everyone at MSF. I really appreciate the invite to come speak with you today. Ava, Raz, Mihir also have been dealing with them very regularly on this legislation. So again, I always thank you for your time, for your expertise and insight. It's immensely valuable for us on the congressional side. And before I get started, I just wanted to also note that while I have the pleasure to sort of be here today and talk to you about the legislation, I wouldn't be here discussing this without the incredible work of my colleagues at the Committee on Oversight and Reform, and that's especially Lisa Klepper and Ali Golden, who well before my time on the committee conducted and completed a nearly 3-year investigation into pharmaceutical company pricing practices. And the legislation I'm talking to you about today is the direct result of their painstaking work. So I just want to make a note of that really quickly. As a bit of background to respond to Yanis's question and to give you all a bit of background about the legislation that we're discussing today, I just want to give a quick summary and background of the committee's drug pricing investigation that provided the inspiration for this bill. So over the course of 5 hearings and 8 reports, and based on the review of hundreds of thousands of internal company documents, the committee revealed that the justifications that are frequently offered by pharmaceutical industry for high prices, which often includes research and development, manufacturing, and other costs, were simply not supported by the data. The committee found that pharmaceutical companies' investments in R&D were far outpaced by revenue gains. For example, in response to the committee's request, Pfizer identified a total of $914 million US currency and R&D expenditures related to its drug Lyrica from the period 2009 to 2018, which is equivalent to an approximately 4% of the company's $23 billion in net US revenue from the drug for that same period. It's obviously a minor fraction of their total revenue for that one drug. And although it's not as directly related to the bill I'll discuss in a moment, the committee also found during the investigation that even if the pharmaceutical industry collected less revenue due to pricing reforms, drug companies could maintain or even exceed their current R&D expenditures if they simply reduce spending on stock buybacks and dividends. So from 2016 to 2020, the 14 leading drug companies spent $577 billion US on stock buybacks and dividends, $56 billion more than they spent on R&D over that same period. The committee also found during its investigation that companies dedicated a significant portion of their R&D expenditures to research that was intended to extend their market monopolies, supporting the company's marketing strategies and even suppressing competition. One example is internal documents that were recovered by the committee show that AbbVie's R&D investments for its drug Humira focused on what it called, quote, enhancements to the drug that in effect would only protect it against biosimilar competition. One internal presentation from the same company, AbbVie, emphasized that an objective of the enhancement strategy was to, quote, raise barriers to competitors' abilities to replicate the drug, close quote. Another presentation to the board of directors described investments in Humira, quote, enhancement as a biosimilar defense strategy. Many of the companies that were scrutinized during the committee's investigation made R&D investments in their drugs after other research demonstrated the potential for significant financial returns. So as a cross-section, Amgen, AbbVie, Mallinckrodt, Signify acquired the rights to market Enbrel, Imbruvica, Acthar, and Lantus, respectively, after the drugs demonstrated financial success on the market already. Pfizer, Celgene, and Novartis relied heavily on taxpayer-funded research to develop Lyrica, Revlimid, Gleevec, respectively. As another example of this approach, an internal Celgene strategic rationale memorandum from April 2009 shows that Celgene relied on previously federally funded research to justify investing in a larger study of its cancer drug Revlimid. The memorandum also estimated the net present value of the investment at, quote, nearly 1.5 billion, close quote, with, quote, an internal rate of return on investment of 114%. Additional internal company data obtained by the committee during the investigation also confirmed that companies' price increases were not justified by manufacturing costs. For some drugs, such as Humira and Lyrica, manufacturing costs increased at a rate significantly lower than the rate of price increases. For other drugs, such as Copaxone and Enbrel, manufacturing costs actually declined as the company raised prices. For all of the companies that we studied on the committee, manufacturing costs for their drugs were equivalent to only a fraction of their annual revenue from those same drugs. So in conjunction with the release of its final report, and as I mentioned, there were 8 reports over the course of the 3-year investigation, but the final sort of cumulative report, reporting on all the review of those 1.5 million pages of documents over the course of 3 years, the committee recommended that Congress consider reforms to increase transparency around pharmaceutical investment in R&D. We argued that cost transparency would provide valuable data about companies' investments in innovation, and their claims that high cost of R&D justify the skyrocketing prices of their drugs. The committee also argued that transparency would also inform policies to help government fund its own trials and incentivize innovation at the same time. And we're very excited, Jan, to tie into the second part of your question, to announce, if folks missed it, that just a few weeks ago, a little over a month ago, the committee led by Chairwoman Maloney and co-sponsored by a couple of her colleagues in the House of Representatives, and with a Senate co-sponsor bill as their companion bill, so a bicameral piece of legislation, took a major step towards implementing and making these recommendations a reality by introducing the Pharmaceutical Research and Transparency Act of 2022. The act would amend the Public Health Service Act and the Securities Exchange Act to increase public transparency into the actual cost of pharmaceutical research. And as I've been discussing, and as demonstrated in the committee's investigation, these companies frequently cite R&D expenditures to justify their high and sort of incessantly increasing prescription drug prices, despite data suggesting that these high prices far exceed the amounts necessary to fund the actual R&D done by the companies. Our Act, the Research and Transparency Act, would directly reform this practice by requiring drug companies to report overall R&D expenditures, as well as disaggregated costs for individual clinical trials, which are not currently reported in the United States. The legislation would provide valuable data on companies' investments in pharmaceutical innovation, would enable detailed evaluation of pharmaceutical industry claims about their R&D expenditures, and inform future policies to ensure meaningful innovation. A main goal of the bill was to sort of increase and promote transparency while also increasing and promoting innovation in the drug space simultaneously. So practically, to carry out the reform, the Pharmaceutical Research and Transparency Act would direct the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which is a cabinet level position in the United States, acting through the National Institutes of Health, to create a publicly accessible repository of cost data linked to clinicaltrials.gov for applicable drug clinical trials. Each responsible party of an applicable clinical trial would be required to post cost data disaggregated by year within 1 year of the completion of their clinical trial. Cost data would include the total cost of the trial, the cost of the trial per patient, expenditures for certain other categories, including personnel, materials and supplies, and healthcare services provided to trial subjects. And responsible parties would be required to certify that the data submitted is complete and accurate. And there would be penalties, obviously, for either misidentifying, mischaracterizing, or omitting data in these filings. There would be teeth sort of to those requirements. And so the Research and Transparency Act would also amend the Securities Exchange Act to require drug manufacturers to file with the Securities and Exchange Commission to disclose drug research and development expenditures disaggregated by clinical trial phase in their annual report. So there would effectively be two forms of reporting, both to the SEC, which, as you all I'm sure know, is more of a financial sort of watchdog, and also to the more sort of standard United States health and science agencies. As I mentioned before, we're very excited. You know, the political environment in Washington, D.C. is complicated as ever, maybe more particularly complicated in the last few years, but for this bill, we worked very hard, and MSF was an invaluable sort of companion in this process to get bipartisan support, bicameral support. As I mentioned, the bill was introduced in the House. That same day, a companion bill was introduced in the Senate with multiple co-sponsors and co-leads. So we're very excited for it. It's early days. It's only about a month old at this point in time, but we're excited to keep pushing it forward, especially with MSF's collaboration. So thank you, Giannis, and I will toss it back to you.
Ben, just a quick question. Is this the first time that there is such a push, or anything that comes to your memory in terms of previous attempts?
So I think, you know, drug pricing, at least in the US, is kind of a perennial subject and has been a subject of debate probably well before all of us were born, and it has kind of come to a head, I think, in the last few years. As I'm sure some of you saw, there was an attempt to sort of bake drug pricing reforms like this reform into a larger sort of omnibus package that I think, because of the realities of American politics, has faced some headwinds. So one of our approaches was to sort of break that out from the larger package and sort of have the bill proceed on its own, which we're hoping will sort of clear a path for it to sort of get through the quote unquote process here, maybe a bit more seamlessly than it would have as a part of a larger package. So I guess a long way to answer your question, that I think it's something we've always been concerned with. I do think it has gotten sort of more of a consensus, hopefully bipartisan consensus, to sort of actually take steps to address these particular issues.
Thank you, Ben. And now we move to South Africa and to Professor Glenda Gray. Good to see you, Glenda, and thank you very much for joining us. Glenda, she is the President and CEO of the South African Medical Research Council. And correct me if I'm wrong, Glenda, but you are actually funding clinical trials. You are doing clinical trials. And I would like to understand better, and also for our audience to understand, perhaps you can tell us this theme, what does it say to you? Disclosing clinical trial costs. Is it realistic? Is it desirable? Is it feasible? So give us your perspective, please.
Yeah, so I'll talk from the perspective of a funder, and also from the perspective of someone who's involved in international HIV vaccine trials and gets to look at budgets, and as well as the South African Clinical Trial Registry, which is something that the MRC hosts. So let me start off with the South African Clinical Trial Registry. So we do collect funding information. When people have to register their trial, we collect the funder's name, which is important. and the total national budget, but that's only for the trial sites in South Africa. And things like the laboratory costs and are known if you are the funder, but may not be known if you're participating in a global study. But what we don't collect costs, which I think is critical and maybe hasn't been brought up yet, which I hope also will be addressed, is the cost of clinical research organizations. And that's completely non-transparent, the cost of clinical research organizations, what they cost. And I've heard, just looking at the data from our international experience with the NIH and HIV vaccine trials, sometimes the clinical research organizations cost more than the clinical trial site budgets for a country. So I think that's an important issue. We don't know what PPD, Archivia, Triclinium charge to oversee the monitoring of trials. And that might be an area where one can cost save. And often pharmaceutical companies get into an arrangement with a certain CRO, and they basically will work with a CRO for years without disclosing the kind of funding. So in terms of our clinical trial trial registry, we look at the funding type, and then we can we can categorize industry, government, university, or self-funded. After this information is collected, the public can view the funding details, except the national budget. But the research and the registry staff and admin have access to all this data because they have to be able to report to the National Department of Health to inform the funding spend on clinical research in South Africa. And we can also use these data to understand the budget spent on different types of trials and trends in financing over a period to the trial registration date. And I think it's very important that we do look, particularly if it's government funding, and government funding big pharma, like we saw with the COVID vaccine trials. It's important for us to understand, the commitment of government funding, because that will also influence it should influence the cost of goods at the end. Because if the federal funds or the public purse has bankrolled all the risk, there is no reason why some of these drugs or vaccines are priced at a certain value. So I think it's very important for us. So for the MRC, obviously we don't have lots of money. And so, we scrutinize the budgets very carefully. And because we can see we homogenize the trial costs for studies that we fund. And so we know what the per participant, we work out a reasonable per participant trial cost, and we then, have a little band around it, and we make sure that there's equity at a clinical trial site in South Africa, and that there's no competition or people that are putting in too much money for putting their or loading their budgets. As well. When we work with the NIH and the HIV vaccine clinical trial, we also are able to view at a global level the distribution of clinical trial costs. And the clinical sites are not the drivers, of the cost of the trials, but the laboratory budgets are, and as well as the clinical research organizations. And I think we have to get transparency on all three things. And for me, the trial sites are the ones that actually suffer the most, the ones that don't make a profit because, they get beaten down per participant to be able to afford the studies. So particularly if it's government funded or federal funded, is because obviously you want good value for money. But where there is lack of transparency is in data management and CRO work, and the costs that these companies use to oversee the clinical trials. So I think it'd be important to get some information on the breakdown. Laboratory as well, I guess, for investigational research and for HIV vaccine trials, and when you're looking for correlates, the laboratory costs will be high because it spurs a whole lot of translational research. And so I think we can accept high laboratory costs, because this is how we spur the basic science on, and that will be an important component of it. And so I think it's very important, and I love the idea, particularly from pharmaceutical companies, to understand, what's driving the cost. And certainly it's not the trial sites that are driving the costs. There's a lot of other ones, and particularly when federal or public money is used for clinical trials, there should be some kind of agreement between the public, between public funding and the pharmaceutical, that protects the cost of goods should the vaccine or the drug be successful. What also, is not, there's also a lack of transparency in diagnostics, and the cost of diagnostics, and who drives the diagnostics. We spend a lot of time scrutinizing the cost of pharmaceutical goods, but the diagnostics also seem to fall under the radar. And just from the from our COVID experience, the cost of a PCR is far higher than the cost of a vaccine, and we use PCRs much more frequently than we utilize vaccines. And so they seem to, diagnostic companies have seemed to have escaped the public scrutiny in terms of their costs. And we need to have some investigation in that arena. So I'll stop there, and if there's any more questions you'd like to ask me.
Thank you. Well, actually, I really appreciate it, because you shed light into different links of the chain. I would like just to a quick follow-up question. So making this kind of information publicly available, disclosing this kind of information to the public, to you, does it sound like a good idea, or is it something that's going to make your life or others' lives more difficult?
I think it's critical for funding information to be publicly available, especially when trials have been funded from government organizations for goods, for long-acting PrEP, for instance. We know the cost of the long-acting PrEP will be $2,400, and the NIH bankrolled the clinical trial development, and so trying to understand why something that's going to help control HIV at a global level, and particularly in low and middle income countries, why it's so expensive is hard to understand. And so I think those kind of things, it's hard to understand the exit price when the federal funding has bankrolled it. So I think it's important. It's in the public interest to share this information, and benefits of sharing this information will alleviate the misconceptions that the product is mainly for profits, or confirm that it's mainly for profits. So in South Africa, we have some challenges. And what we have is in our South African Good Clinical Trials guideline, which I think we need to revise after hearing from the group, which says an investigator must disclose to the Research Ethics Committee and the sources, but doesn't really talk about the public disclosure. And so I think by only making us disclose to the Ethics Committee presents us an opportunity to resist sharing funding information in the public domain when it's the right thing to do. So I think we should look at our GCP guidelines and make sure that this information is reported, but is reported to ethics committees and to our regulatory authorities, but is not publicly reported, which I think therefore leads to lack of disclosure and a lack of assimilation of the costs, so that we can have good discussions about the distribution of funding in South Africa.
Thank you, Glenda. And I really like the fact that you referred to a public funding at least 20 times. And the question, and there, of course, raises the question of conditionalities, perhaps, and what do we do about this funding, and how do we guarantee that we have some sort of a return on this multifaceted, multi-layered public support that would go beyond the public investment?
Yeah, just to make the point that you can't bankroll and fund the clinical development and then sell it back to the government, which is what happened with COVID vaccine research, is that the federal government bankrolled it, and then the pharmaceutical companies sold it back to the countries. And that's obscene, in my opinion.
Very well put. And from now we move to from South Africa to Brazil. Over to you, Mateus Falsao. Lovely to see you, and thank you for joining us. Mateus, he is a health analyst with IDEC, if I pronounce it correctly, the Brazilian Consumer Protection Institute. Mateus, can you walk us through a bit what you've been trying to achieve on the ground when it comes to pushing for transparency and for disclosing clinical trial costs? And what kind of pushback have you faced so far? Are you happy with your progress? Thank you.
Thank you, Yanis. It's really great to be with you all today, sharing this amazing panel. I'd like to thank MSF Access Campaign for inviting us, and even take this opportunity to commend the amazing work done by the MSF Access Campaign here in Brazil and globally. They are very important. You were very important partners on this struggle for access to medicines, and in our case, transparency policies, or pushing for more transparency policies. So we are a civil society organization in Brazil, a nationwide organization. We work in different fields, pushing for better economic regulations and economic policies. And one of our key principles is to achieve right to health, as it's even mandate in our constitution. And within right to health, we have a key element, which is pharmaceutical assistance, the universalization of access to medicines, which includes, from our perspective, regulation measures in order to ensure access to medicines in a very large landscape. It includes then regulation measures around economic relations, like transparency measures. And I'd like to discuss a bit, as Yanis was while introducing, what we have been doing on transparency and why we believe this is so important to increase access to medicines and to better achieve right to health. So IDEC, with different organizations in Brazil, especially patients advocacy organizations and other organizations as well, is working since 2021 in a campaign that we call in Portuguese, Remédio a Preço Justo, which would translate to drugs at a fair price. Basically, this campaign, I just would like to quickly introducing the campaign to you. It tries to achieve a better regulation for drug pricing in Brazil. We already have, as many other countries, a system in place for drug pricing regulation, and would like to improve this. We have a draft bill on the Brazilian Senate, draft bill 5591 from 2020. And this draft bill basically introduces a whole setting, a package of measures to better regulate drug pricing in Brazil, including transparency measures. In terms of transparency, the measures would be to add some requirements for transparency in the act of registry. In other words, in order to get market approval, companies would have to disclose data on a few items. That's what we call the transparency requirements. It's very important to remark that we already have in Brazil these requirements. So in order to get market approval, companies already have to disclose some information, for instance, in logistics and a few manufacturing costs, estimated costs, but not at all in innovation-related costs. So basically, what we are working here is to add some transparency requirements on the Registry Act, in the Market Approval Act, that would mandate companies to disclose information about R&D costs. For instance, all information related to preclinical research and also related to clinical trials costs. This is the basic this is the basic idea of the campaign related to transparency. So if this draft bill is approved in the Brazilian Parliament, every time a company would register a new drug, especially this innovative drugs, they would have to disclose information. That's what we have been campaigning around this draft bill on the Brazilian Senate. I just would like to highlight this because this is one of the ways in which we could achieve transparency regarding clinical trials, right? This is the path we choose to campaign, which basically we are trying to make a requirement in the act of registry on market approval. And just to remark, we already have some requirements. We'll then expand these requirements to R&D and clinical trials costs. An important point to remark is that this transparency requirements within the campaign that we are trying to push forward would be the disclose about public funding In other words, how much the company itself spent on the innovation and how much it received from governments, including other governments that not the Brazilian government, in order to develop this drug. And this is important, and I would like to discuss a little bit now why we believe that transparency is important and why we would even ask in our ideal model for companies to disclose public fundings that they receive in other countries, for instance, to develop this particular drug. So let's move forward for the second question. Why transparency? Why do you believe that transparency is so important to ensure access to medicines? I would highlight 4 major reasons. The first one, accountability. Even for countries like Brazil, which has this public goal of universalizing pharmaceutical assistance, it's important to understand the costs. So accountability in the public spending concerning medicines. The second reason would be monitoring of the market. We have a few institutions in South America. I would highlight Brazil itself and Colombia, in which the agencies, especially the medicines agency, had started to monitor the market in order to understand how prices were behaving, and that produced a better understanding of the behavior of prices. For instance, we have a very, not very good, but the ongoing in developing database in Brazil that basically lists procurement prices for all medicines that are procured by governments in Brazil. And this is very important, which also takes me to the third major reason for transparency, which is to increase bargain power in procurement process. So if we have further transparency, we would have a better point from governments to make when they are procuring medicines. This is also something very important to transparency, especially here when we consider that in this process, when the company that has the monopoly, usually patent-related monopoly, but also all other sorts of monopoly, they would say that they have to charge this very high prices because of the investment on innovation, on clinical trials. This is why add some transparency requirements would give governments a better bargain power. But also there is a more fourth reason that I think it's even more sophisticated. With this data available, at least for regulators, we struggle that it has to be available for civil society, for society in general as well, but at least for regulator, we could think of maybe a drug pricing regulation policy based on costs and on actual costs, on real price. In other words, we would confront companies with this point that they always make concerning that I have to charge this very high price because I invested on innovation. I paid for the clinical trials. We don't know if that's true. We don't know how much a clinical trial really costs. We don't know how much the company actually put of their own resources in this clinical trials because we have a lot of public funding. We know that the innovation chain is highly complex. So with transparency requirements, we would have a better vision, a better view, a clear perspective on this. And this also would provide, the third reason again, better bargain power to governments to confront companies on this bargain on the procurement prices. But getting back to the fourth reason, we could have inputs for a drug pricing regulation that would consider that. And finally, and here I come to my final idea on this initial presentation, we could discuss the idea, and this is something we have been trying to push a lot in the Brazilian agenda, of excessive pricing. So when a company is charging a price, which is not justifiable, they would not be able to do this. This would be a key principle of the drug pricing regulation system. And if we have clinical trial data, especially on costs, as an input for the system, we could further develop the idea of excessive pricing. This is why we did this campaign that was initially on its core idea, a campaign to improve the price regulation system. We included this transparency requirements as a very good shift that we believe to be a very good shift on the Brazilian law and the Brazilian regulation. I also would like to highlight that policies that civil society have been pushing in the recent years, like increased competition, maybe are not sufficient in face of new challenges. For instance, if we think in genetic therapies or anti-monoclonal antibodies, biotechnological drugs, it's hard to ensure competitions. There's even some restraints concerning technology transfer. So it would be interesting to explore different policies. For instance, drug price regulations. For instance, the increase of transparency as an input, as increase of bargain power, and as we are saying, as a very important policy for decreased drug pricings and ensuring access to medicines and realizing right to health. Thank you. I am here and I'm available for the discussion.
Thank you, Mateus. Thank you. Very, very comprehensive. Can I just remind people, please feel free to engage also on Twitter using the hashtag clinical trial resolution, because we need to keep in mind that this discussion is happening in light of next week's discussion at the WHA in Geneva around the proposed UK-Argentina resolution. So we move from Brazil. We're doing this little world tour during this event today. We move back to the US to Rachel Cohen. Rachel, great pleasure to see you. Rachel, she's the US Executive Director with DNDI. I'm sure most of us have heard of DNDI. I'm personally a fan, the Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative. Rachel, what is DNDI's position on the question of disclosing the clinical trial cost? Obviously, you are teaming up with companies, you are doing clinical trials, you are doing R&D. What sort of information are you disclosing actually?
So our view at DNDI is that, of course, it's critically important to ensure clinical cost transparency, clinical trial cost transparency, but also transparency sort of across the innovation life cycle. So full R&D costs, not only clinical trial costs, and also greater transparency around open sharing of research, knowledge, and data, around manufacturing costs and cost of goods. This is, by the way, the best way probably to determine a fair price, is if we have a really good sense of, in fact, what the actual cost to produce is, plus a reasonable and fair margin, and also transparency about contractual terms and conditions for R&D funding, advanced purchase commitments, and so forth. I say this and kind of zoom out to 30,000 feet because, as we've witnessed in a sort of terribly acute way during these past 2 years of the pandemic, hoarding of knowledge and data and intellectual property, and indeed life-saving health technologies and tools, has resulted in these grotesque inequities in access to COVID-19 vaccines, tests, treatments, and led also to millions of preventable deaths. So transparency at a much deeper level is something that we need to work on. But clinical trials, as others have said today, are indeed the most expensive part of the R&D process. And so cost transparency is critical. And without it, and I think this is sort of why we've been stuck for so long, the policy discussion about what it actually takes to finance R&D and how we determine a fair price is really quite muddled. And the real life consequences are dire, as Mateus described in the Brazilian contest. So in our view, R&D cost transparency is important just in itself because it helps to debunk the myth that prices of drugs, vaccines, or other health tools have to be high to recoup investments in R&D. Just a sidebar here, the fact is that R&D costs were never used by industry to determine price. As Professor Gray rightly said, pricing strategies are essentially driven by whatever the market will bear. But to clarify the terms of the debate, it's useful to unpack, at least to the extent possible, what it actually costs to carry out R&D, whether from the earliest stage of scientific discovery during the final stages of clinical development, or from end to end, and then disconnect this actually from the discussion about how to establish a fair price. That's the first reason we think that this is critical. The second is, of course, perhaps the most important, that R&D cost transparency and clinical trial cost transparency is critical because it's the only way to have a better sense of what a realistic range is to help governments make decisions about the level of their financial investment investments in R&D. So there's countless discussions happening now about what lessons we can learn from COVID and where and how investments in future pandemic preparedness should be made. I have to say here that there is an enormous amount we need to do now to course correct for COVID that should not be sacrificed in the hours of discussion that are happening about pandemic preparedness, but I digress. Within these discussions, there are loads of proposals, reports, and resolutions, including the one that we're discussing today, that make the case for investments in clinical trial infrastructure. But how much? And where? Are there specific strategies, or are there specific types of networks that could better address often neglected research questions, especially in low and middle income countries, and maybe even reduce costs? So having real life data can enable policymakers to make just better decisions about maximizing their investments in R&D. So these are some of the many reasons that DNDi has been working with MSF, Doctors for America, and Knowledge Ecology International, our colleagues at the Oversight and Reform Committee. Ben, nice to see you here, to support the Pharmaceutical Research Transparency Act that Ben described. It's also why we're supportive of the clinical trial resolution that's been introduced by Argentina and the UK, that is kind of the motivation for this discussion and is currently being discussed in advance of the World Health Assembly next week. So there's a few points that could be strengthened, we think, including kind of strengthening provisions around transparency in that, but it's a really important and timely resolution. But I think probably what DNDi can contribute most to this discussion is just our own experience. For several years now, DNDi has been publishing our own figures for what it has cost us to develop many of the 9 treatments that we've delivered over the past 20 years for neglected communities. It's an important principle because most of our funding is from the public sector, so from governments and philanthropic sources, and we believe we need to be transparent in the way that we use these funds, help funders and of course the general public gain trust and also understand what it means to have a public return on public investments in R&D. And we've tried in our most recently published figures from 2019 to share kind of several useful bits of information. We've broken down the costs by product type. So what has it cost us to develop a new formulation or a combination of existing drugs versus a new chemical entity, and also by R&D stage. So we've reported costs for early discovery, translational research, and then late stage clinical development, meaning in our case, phase 2 and 3 plus registration. And then finally, we've reported kind of raw figures and figures with, to the extent possible and using a specific methodology, attrition also calculated. I want to say here that it's important that we not consider the figures that DNDi has published to be an apples to apples comparison with those figures that are often cited by industry. It started at 1 billion, 2 billion, I think I've heard 4 billion recently. There's just far too many methodological differences and other factors that make a comparison really problematic. We can kind of talk about what the main cost drivers are in our model, but our hope is that it's just valuable in itself to be transparent about our actual costs, and also that it can help give a sense of just the order of magnitude difference when comparing real life costing data with some of those estimates that are kind of out there. So just to actually say what they are, we've calculated that for new formulations or new combinations of existing drugs, it has cost us between 4 and 10 million euro. That's the raw, 4 to 12 million if you calculate with attrition. And for a new chemical entity, it has cost between 45 and 70 million euros. Here's where attrition makes a bigger impact. With attrition, that's 60 to 190 million roughly. So again, we're not inviting apples to apples comparisons here, but we do think that publishing our own costs gives a pretty good overview, at least for anti-infectives, and it helps identify what some of the main cost drivers and areas of potential savings could be. We've benchmarked our figures both against some industry CRO costs. Professor Gray, I appreciated your comment about that being sometimes a black box, and by a WHO-backed methodology. And we're in the same ballpark. So I'll close my remarks there unless you have any other questions, Yanis, but just wanted to share at least from the practical experience that DNDi has both what our experience is, but also why we think this is so important in improving access to health technologies and tools.
Absolutely, thank you, Rachel. And of course, it's always very useful and helpful and very constructive in the debate to bring in the DNDi hands-on experience and to share what you've been doing and your findings and how you've been doing things. I would like to see that there are questions coming in. Feel free to keep writing your questions in the Q&A chat. I'll do my best to bring them in the discussion. I see there are quite a few already for Ben. Ben, I mean, now, how are you? We know how powerful the lobby, the pharma lobby is in the US, and you said that there have been many attempts in the past. And how are you planning on countering this opposition, which is coming your way?
So that's a fantastic point and very valid, and I'm sure folks on this call have seen the reporting on pharmaceutical companies spending on lobbying has always been significant. It's increased significantly on top of that in the last year, and some of that I think was in response to our investigation about pricing. There's been increases, I think, of as much as 20% or 30% year over year on lobbying spending. I can speak from my personal experience that I have not seen examples of that being directed specifically to us in the committee. Obviously, I think there's a sort of whole of government approach from the lobbying firms. I think our position is, the work the committee has done on the drug pricing investigation sort of speaks for itself, and I don't think we have any intent to back off of that at all. I think we are also encouraged by the fact that there's been bipartisan and bicameral buy-in for these bills, because we're talking about one bill in particular today, but there's a package of bills that the committee has rolled out that all seek to sort of get at manipulations by the pharma industry that lead to an increase in prices. So this is one of three. So I think we're very committed to pushing those through, and I think we've gotten pretty good buy-in from folks sort of all across the spectrum. So there are headwinds, as always, but I think we're pretty hopeful for this package in particular. And I think one thing that helps this package is in the US in particular, there's a lot of discussion of co-pays, out-of-pocket expenses, and that in particular impacting insulin and people's ability to access affordable insulin or access insulin at all. I think what helps these bills is they are specific. I think they go after specific practices and specific problems. So they're not a sweeping reform. It's not going to, quote unquote, fix the whole industry, but it goes after particular practices that we identified in our investigation. I think that also sort of helps it because it is sort of a very specific fix to a specific practice. But yes, we will continue the struggle, I think, for some time.
And speaking of particular practices, there is a question also by Till Bruckner of Transparent in the chat. I mean, how does this bill go beyond the current enforcement foreseen by the FDA in terms of publishing the clinical trial results?
I saw that question. That's a great question and very valid. So I think from our perspective on the committee, we sort of have two mandates. One of them is to do investigations and identify areas where legislation could be created that would sort of fill a gap or fix a problem that's not addressed by other legislation that already exists. And another would be to sort of hold federal executive agencies to account for not enforcing existing laws. So I think our idea here is that the bills that we're introducing and sort of pushing now, this package of bills, would sort of address issues that we don't think have been addressed by prior legislation. I think on the enforcement front from FDA and NIH, I think our specific sort of responsibility as the Oversight and Reform Committee is to push those agencies to enforce laws that actually are still actually on the books. So I think from our perspective, rather than drafting new legislation, I guess it could amplify those authorities, but we do believe those agencies have the authority now to enforce. They just maybe aren't doing it as effectively or as aggressively as they could, which we also do see that as a responsibility of our committee to sort of prod them to do that. So that's a perfectly valid question.
Thank you, Ben. And Glenda, I just saw that you replied in the chat, but I want to make sure that I give you the floor because the question is fantastic. I mean, how do we factor into, if I can speak using those terms, people's participation in clinical trials, and how do we monetize the value of such contributions, and we make sure that there is some sort of a return on this contribution? Please go ahead.
Yeah. So we have access failure And you know, I'll give you a good example is the long-acting cabotegravir that East and Southern Africa helped establish its effectiveness. And this is probably the best thing since we have been unable to find an HIV vaccine. Yet access was never discussed. You know, the trials were run, and now we're sitting in a situation where it's completely unaffordable for the local market that was critical in helping it establish its success. And so we can't have, you know, there has to be, you know, access governance has to be put on we can't have a TB vaccine that is established its effectiveness in Africa and then have no access to it. And so I think, you know, when particularly if these studies are funded by the public purse, you know, that we have to have access questions, access discussions right up front, and not wait now. Now we're suddenly waiting and we're waiting, or maybe USAID or Global Fund will pick up the cost of the long-acting cabotegravir and help us roll it out. And so that's not good enough. And I think that we have to try and find a way of making sure that that these conditions are written in to any contracting that happens when federal funds are used. And you know, and I'm talking about, you know, the NIH bankrolls a lot of these clinical development, and yet there's, you know, once the pharmaceutical companies you know, establish its efficacy on using public money, then the cost of goods become prohibitive to the very people that helped establish it. So there has to be a different way of doing business. And if it is, you know, if everyone else is covering the risk, the clinical trial risks, it's hard to see why pharmaceutical companies make profit and don't have access, particularly to the countries that helped establish its impact. And so I understand that Medicine's patent pool, I think, or is it DNDR, Rachel? I can't remember. Is discussing licensing, and you know, but this kind of thing should be done up front, and so that if these things do happen, voluntary licensing and local, you know, and production at regional hubs, you know, should occur. And these are the kind of ways we can de-risk access in places, you know, with kind of diseases like HIV, which affects Africa disproportionately.
Rachel, would you like to comment? Would you like to come on in this?
Sure. It's Medicine's patent pool principally that are involved in those discussions, not DNDi, but could not possibly agree more with the notion of, you know, the need to set up some kind of access principles or benefit sharing principles around clinical trial participation. As we know, clinical trials are never the product of just one entity or organization or company. It's always a collaboration of some sort that has to rely on, you know, the national system in which a clinical trial is being run. Of course, the trial participants, which is absolutely critical and completely ignored in many cases in terms of thinking about their contribution to the scientific process. And then, of course, all of the different players that are involved from the public, private, or nonprofit sector. So it's super important that we have some kind of process for not only sort of the bare minimum, which is ensuring access to the end product for the trial participants or the communities that hosted clinical trials, but just a much broader kind of shift in the rules of the game, if you will, that access and benefit sharing is put at the beginning of the R&D process, at the conception phase, or as early as possible in the R&D process, and not something that is being discussed once a product has been approved in rich countries. This is totally backwards. And then I wanted to respond to, if I may, I think Manuel put a question in the chat about adaptive platform trials. This is close to our heart because DNDi, as some of you know, have been running an adaptive platform trial called Anti-Cove during COVID-19 with 25 African and global health partners to look for treatments from mild to moderate COVID that would help, of course, to prevent disease progression, hospitalization, and death. And what will be incredibly important moving forward is to make sure that these clinical trial networks, that this kind of infrastructure and that platforms that exist Glenda has spoken about this many times, using the HIV and TB infrastructure in South Africa and other parts of the world has been totally critical to the sort of rapid capacity of all the different players to carry out clinical trials. Without it, without South Africa's infrastructure, we would not be anywhere near as fast in terms of the clinical development timelines. But what happens during non-pandemic times? That's, I think, a big question. It's something that's, in a way, raised in the clinical trial resolution, not revolution. How do we make sure those platform trials are flexible, that they're autonomous, that they can respond super promptly when there's an emerging outbreak, say, and be capable of conducting ongoing research during kind of the trough times, you know what I mean, during the non-pandemic times? This is a really critical question, one of, I think, the most important things that we're going to need to solve as a result of COVID, and as we look ahead to future pandemic preparedness efforts.
I see a question also in the chat that will bring us back to the ongoing negotiations ahead of the WHA. But before I go to that, Mateus, you know, there are many initiatives. There was the WHA resolution, the transparency resolution. I'm sure that was a source of inspiration also for your work. Then there was an Italian piece of legislation brought forward trying to translate the WHO resolution into national legislation. Where do you get your inspiration from also for your ongoing advocacy, and how easy is it for you to communicate your messages to the broader public also in Brazil and to get the public opinion, let's say, on board?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I also thank Marco for making this question on the chat. I think this is very important. When we were developing this campaign and even the inputs for the parliamentary discussion, we tried to study a whole setting of options for a national policy on transparency, on R&D investments, R&D costs. I believe that we see transparency as a guideline, as a principle, but there are different ways of implementing that, right? I would highlight here 3 ways that we consider. One would be transparency requirements on the market approval process, or even in the drug pricing policy. I guess they're quite similar, and I guess we drew some inspiration here for sure from the Italian experience. We even held a webinar with some technicians from the Italian Medicine Agency a few years ago, actually. So yeah, I believe this would be one model, and this is the model we choose as well. And we choose this model, I have to make this very clear, because we believe that this model would politically work better for Brazil, considering our political context, our institutions. But there are other models as well that we could put in place. I will highlight 2 other ones here that are also very much in our national political agenda. You can put transparency requirements on the act of procurement. So for instance, if you have Ministry of Health, like Brazilian one that procures medicines, they have a lot of procurement power. They have a lot of power because they can choose from where they are procuring their drugs, right? And in the act of the procurement, you can add some transparency requirements. This would be a different model, for instance, that I guess civil society and regulators could discuss within the national context. A third model that I would highlight that we also try to push here in Brazil would be antitrust authorities. So for instance, we have, this would be a post-excessive pricing. We have a process here, a complaint against the price of a drug for hepatitis C with a lot of civil society, in which we ask the antitrust authority to mandate the company to disclose their R&D costs on the developing of this drug, so sofosbuvir, because we believe that this is the main point they make to charge this, what we call excessive pricing. So these are 3 different paths to ensure transparency, and I believe each country will find a better way. As I said, we try to get inspiration for the WHO, from the WHO discussion, from the Italian experience as well, for sure. And considering our constants, we decided that this would be the better path, but for sure there are different paths. And I think in the national context, we should explore what fits better the political context in order to start a campaign as we did, for instance.
And has it been, Mateus, has it been easy to communicate to the broader public, to the wider public around these topics for you in Brazil? Somebody needs to unmute Mateus, please.
Thank you. So this is actually a quite challenging issue of the campaign, because in Brazil, this high-priced drugs are procured by the government. So let us say people don't feel the price on their pockets. We have out-of-pocket payment for sure, but for less expensive drugs. If you think of sofosbuvir, hepatitis C drugs, they're not directly procured by people. They're procured by the government, right? So this is a communication issue. We try to solve this issue by including a campaign about all drugs. So we discuss all types of drugs. This was a first matter, including out-of-pocket payments. So we believe that there's also a need for transparency in these drugs, for instance, insulin and diabetics-related drugs. But we also try to build relationships, partnerships with patients association. This has been very useful in order to push this agenda because they are very much related to people that suffer from the lack of the drugs that they need because the government cannot procure, considering the excessive pricing. So I believe these two strategies were very useful in order to communicate with the broader public.
Thank you, Mateus. I'm sure that Ben and colleagues will have a lot to share also from their experience in the US. Obviously, the landscape is different in the US and in Brazil, but still. Rachel, over to you, and if someone can unmute Rachel, please. Looking at the proposed draft in terms of the resolution that we are today talking about, how happy are you? What is missing? What would, there is also a question by Thierry in the chat from Knowledge College International on this. What do you make of it?
Well, I mean, I think we're really supportive of it in general. Particularly the aspects of the resolution that have to do with supporting existing clinical trial infrastructure and strengthening where it needs to be strengthened in low and middle income countries in particular. I mean, I think we share a lot of, we're quite aligned with MSF's analysis of sort of where things could be strengthened. So really recommend that folks have a look at the nice technical briefing that MSF did that I think Francisco put in the chat earlier. Obviously on transparency, which is the reason we're joining this, we believe around a whole host of issues, there could be some strengthening. Around scope, obviously this cannot be limited to vaccines or even just to COVID. There are many pressing public health priorities, and we need transparency and to strengthen clinical trial infrastructure for a whole range. This kind of comes back to the point of supporting infrastructure and networks that are conducting clinical trials during non-pandemic times, and how to kind of learn from the lessons and really try to avoid that boom bust thing that we see in pandemics, the sort of cycle of panic and neglect that leaves these clinical trial sites sort of unsupported during non-crisis times. On equity issues, I think, again, we share concerns about ensuring that there's stronger language perhaps around diversity of populations that are included in clinical trials, including, of course, on the basis of race and ethnicity, gender, and in particular, we're concerned about people of childbearing potential and children being included in clinical trials systematically. We know that we have to wait sometimes years before we know whether a drug is safe and effective in kids or in people of childbearing potential. And around this access and benefit sharing principle that we've been discussing already, not just how to quantify, but really how to enshrine some kind of broader notion around access as a result of participation in clinical trials. There's several other issues, regulatory. We have, as DNDi, I think many of you know, struggled to get access to nirmatrelvir ritonavir, which is the Pfizer antiviral Paxlovid, which I just took last week. In order to conduct follow-on research, we know some generic companies have been having difficulty accessing this product in order to conduct bioequivalent studies, at least those outside of the Medicines Patent Pool licensing scope. And we really just need to resolve this issue once and for all. There really cannot be these kinds of barriers to critical follow-on research or bioequivalent studies. This is unacceptable in any case, certainly during a pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rachel. Glenda, over to you. You mentioned, you highlighted the issue of the public support, right? And the public investment, the public funding. This whole discussion around attaching conditionalities on affordability, transparency, Does this resonate with you? Do you think it's desirable and feasible? And also, what do you learn on this from the South African experience? I mean, the fact that there are clinical trials happening in the country. Are there any promising lessons there that could be used also internationally?
I think it's easier when you're the funder, you know, to talk about benefit sharing. And so if we are going to co-fund a vaccine or a drug or a diagnostic, we put in tech transfer, local manufacturing and access. So it's that's easy for us and to try and make sure that that money coming out of the South African government, we don't just we're not just used as a country to bring in the endpoints, but that we benefit, you know, in terms of manufacturing and access and tech transfer. So that's critical for us, and you know, so it's easier when you are the funder. But that's why the NIH, I would implore the NIH in its contracting with NIH gives away IP to pharmaceutical companies to make money, to make profits. And you know, I think just about every drug has been bankrolled, particularly infective drugs, by the NIH. And some of the, you know, Vaccine Research Center, you know, gives away technology to companies that then become blockbusters like Moderna. And so I think that, so I do think that, you know, in the big companies, in the big countries with, you know, with big deep pockets, you know, the idea of paying for development and then buying back the drug is you know, should be addressed, and maybe this is the next step that can happen when you look at the whole cycle of pharmaceutical funding in the US, and maybe this is a way of generating capital and votes. And I don't understand, you know, that whole system, but maybe it's related to politics and that's in certain voting sectors. I think that must be addressed. Brazil has I think gone the furthest in terms of low middle income country settings to raise the bar, and as has India around costing and also local manufacturing, which is critical for countries. So I think that's important in terms of price setting and manufacturing. So it's harder when you're a smaller country. So 40 million, 70 million people versus 200 million, you have less buying power. And so I think in certain countries and regions, one should have a regional buying force, so that Peru can benefit from the muster and power of Brazil, and South Africa, together with other countries in the region, you know, can become a tour de force in terms of bargaining for drug access. And so I do think that regional muster is important, and to also learn from countries like India and Brazil about how they've done it, and to you know, learn you know, from low middle income country settings that are successful. You know, even with COVID-19, Brazil and Indonesia, you know, did bilateral agreements with drug companies. They didn't wait for COVAX. You know, they used their power, and you know, other countries could learn from that. So I do think political negotiating power, you know, for poorer countries, you know, is achievable, and you know, we should learn from the experiences of countries that are similar to ours, and not just accept the status quo as we see in our region.
Yeah, there are even discussions within the European Union because of the disparities within the European, the richer, the wealthier, and the poorer member states of the Union as to the prospects of full procurement beyond COVID-19, of course. Ben, the NIH is not a good ally, is it? Or am I wrong? Or is there a potential there? Are they listening to you, or are they just ignoring you?
So I'd like to, I guess that goes a little bit existential for me. If they are fully ignoring me, that sort of puts me in a position of sort of reassessing my place in this world, at least professionally. But no, I do think we we do see ourselves as kind of a gadfly for these large executive agencies, agencies under the direction of the president. That's definitely a big piece of what we do, is to sort of be constantly sort of pestering them to adhere to what we see as their mandate, more specifically, more effectively. I think Professor Gray raises a great point that actually connects to a point that both Rachel and Matthias, I think, both made. At least in the US, I think part of this problem is communicating to the American people what is actually happening. I think it's just, the American system, of course, is beyond convoluted, beyond complex. I think people just don't even understand how the drugs get to them. I do think specifically on the funding front, and NIH sort of funding all these drugs end up making billions and billions of dollars for these companies, and the American taxpayer sort of not really seeing the benefit of that outside of the obvious, sort of clinical downstream benefits. It's just a kind of a communication breakdown. And I think that is one thing, at least I think to our mind, you sort of take this problem apart bit by bit, rather than there sort of being like a silver bullet or panacea approach to it. And I think that was one of our ideas with this package of drugs, specifically with the transparency bill, was the idea that, at least in the United States, I'm sure everywhere, pharma presents themselves as a sort of, shining white knight that delivers these miraculous drugs to the people, and therefore the people should not question their benefactors, essentially. And I think that was one of our goals with this investigation and the subsequent legislation, is to sort of show that to be not at all accurate and not at all true. And in fact, the R&D expenditures weren't there in the way that pharma says they are. And in fact, most of the revenue went into the pockets of either shareholders or CEOs or both. And I think sort of deconstructing that image that pharma presents, I think, is a critical component to sort of getting at essentially this racket, I think, that pharma has, of essentially taking the American taxpayers' dollars to fund research and development on drugs that the American taxpayer doesn't really see the sort of at least fiscal benefit. And in fact, the opposite, just a kind of increasing drain on the public fisc. So I think it's a...
Go ahead, please.
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say, I think it's probably a long struggle, but I think that was one of our hopes, at least for both the investigation and the legislation, was to begin sort of that image and that narrative I think the industry presents to the American people.
We didn't get the last part, but I think we get the point.
Janice, may I make a quick intervention here?
Please, Rachel. Go ahead.
Just because of the U.S. perspective here, I'll put that hat on. I mean, I think that I don't want to be naive, but I have a sense that the conversation is shifting here. And it's because you have to literally have been hiding under a rock for the last 2 years to not understand what it means to not have access to a life-saving health tool in the midst of a disease. And you have to have been hiding under a rock to not understand that governments supported an enormous amount of the underlying research for decades, actually, prior to COVID appearing in our lives, and putting up an enormous amount of at-risk financing to guarantee, essentially, that there would be no major losses, even in the event of failure, for companies that needed to have guarantees for manufacturing, production, et cetera, prior to emergency use authorization, for example. I think we have to recognize something kind of that I think is kind of a big deal happened last week at the second Global COVID Summit, when the President of the United States announced that 11 federally funded inventions, and including the spike protein itself, will be kind of openly licensed to the COVID Technology Access Pool and the Medicines Patent Pool. Okay, what the sort of tangible results of that will be obviously remains to be seen. But that was a really big step and a result of a huge amount of work by many groups that are here on this call or on this webinar and that are listening in. And I do think that conversation is happening. Of course, there's something very specific about the US because it's the NIH is the largest funder of biomedical research on the planet, and we all appreciate the uniqueness of the US environment, but that conversation is happening everywhere now. And it's playing out in all of these different WHO conversations and negotiations. It's playing out, of course, at the WTO in terms of ongoing discussions about the need for a waiver on intellectual property. It's going on at the G7 and G20, at many regional blocks. The conversation has shifted. The question is, are we going to learn our lessons this time? Are we actually going to learn our lessons? Are we going to shift the approach and include, for example, much stronger policies, legislation, pandemic instruments, legal instruments that have some teeth, that will actually now say, whether at the global level, the regional level, or the national level, when we talk about financing life-saving, essential innovations of public health importance, we are not going to sacrifice those innovations on the altar of sort of mythology around how they were discovered and developed. We are going to put in place the necessary conditions to ensure equitable access globally for all. That's the question. Have we learned that lesson? If we haven't learned it now, after these 2 years, it's difficult to understand when we will learn it.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I mean, one thing is for sure that obviously we're keeping a close eye on the developments in the US, but also other parts of the world. We see that these initiatives kind of feed off each other. You know, the Italian, the WHA resolution leads to a piece of legislation in Italy, in Brazil, facilitates, let's say, also Ben's work in the US. And obviously, you know, with examples like the clinicaltrials.gov website, these kind of examples set great precedents and shape developments also in other parts of the world. And with that, I think we're coming to a conclusion. So I would like to listen to Mateus, Glenda, Ben, and Rachel with your kind of take-home messages, especially in light of the upcoming World Health Assembly and the discussion on the proposed resolution. What are your key, let's say, messages that you would like all of us to leave from this webinar with? Ben, shall I start with you, if I may?
Sure, absolutely. I think our hope would be to just continue to push the idea of increasing transparency, to both just generally pursue the idea that more transparency is better in all scenarios across all of our endeavors as humans, but also specifically in this context. And I think what we've all sort of been saying here towards the end is that I do think the lack of transparency has allowed very significant corporate interests to craft and create and pursue a narrative that allows them to charge exorbitant amounts of money for drugs while being funded by taxpayer dollars with very little accountability. And so I think that any advance we can make on that front, I think would be helpful on multiple levels. And so I think the work that we're doing in the States, the work that everyone on this call is doing all around the world, and especially with help of MSF, I think is valuable on every level. I think every little piece of this we can chip away at would be helpful. So I think we continue, and this is an encouraging call for me to see that this is not just a thing that we're sort of, you know, working on in our set building in DC. It's good to know that other folks around the world are doing this as well. So
absolutely. There are many like-minded people, and you're not alone. And I can tell you that there are similar discussions happening as we speak, also in Europe. Actually, right before there was a webinar where there was the Deputy Prime Minister of Malta being the staunchest supporter, for instance, of net prices transparency. So transparency is indeed the theme. Glenda, over to you for your concluding remarks.
Yeah, I think MSF is critical to ensuring access and affordability to regions of the world where they cannot afford the full pricing. So I think that work and lobbying must continue for the global poor, including the poor in the US. You know, sometimes we neglect the poor in the US who don't have access to interventions because they don't have access to good insurance schemes. So I think that's important. I think the work that DNDi and Medicine Patent Pool are doing are going to be critical and transformative, you know, as we work through compulsory licensing, voluntary licensing, and better access, and accelerating the process to generic formulations. I think that's going to be critical. And going from the generics of molecules to the generics of vaccines is also going to be critical in the future. And one thing I would add, and which has always been my bugbear as well, is that we mustn't let the diagnostics escape our scrutiny. There is big global shortage, and we should have learned our lesson in COVID-19. There was global shortage of PCR technology, price wars, and people paying, just lack of competition. And I think we really have to, if we're looking for health systems that work, it's not just about affordable vaccines and drugs. It's about having affordable ways to diagnose diseases, and that's critical. And so let's not let the Roche's PCR diagnostics get and get them all and let them get off the hook. And so I do think we should turn our attention to the cost of diagnostics at a global level.
Thank you, Glenda. Thank you for reminding us of that, obviously. Mateus, over to you for your concluding remarks, please.
Thank you. I would say, as a final message, I believe that we are discussing here very innovative policies. And I guess the key message would be, this is possible, because many people would say it's not. And I really agree with Rachel when she says that we have to shift our approach. We have to think of new approach to this issue. And I guess increasing transparency in policies is something that we have to say it's possible, it's feasible, and we have to choose this path in order to ensure access to medicines. I really agree as well with what Glenda was saying, that we have to think of alternative models. For instance, as Glenda well remarked, in Brazil, we produce our COVID-19 vaccines in public manufacturers that also run clinical trials. This is an alternative model to the mainstream approach that work. And I guess we should believe more in this alternative models, like ensuring transparency of, disclosing clinical trial costs, and believe that this is possible and make this messaging spread. And I guess organizations and global networks like MSF or People's Health Movement, for instance, are critical on this debate, especially entering WHO and EB and making this message.
So strong call by you, Mateus, to be bold and to be able to think a bit outside the box where necessary. And last but not least, obviously, to a person who is thinking outside the box, who is also practicing with BNBI outside the box. Rachel Coyne, over to you.
Thank you, Yanis. I think that the lack of equity and transparency, those two issues, they've really been at the core of the breakdown of our current response to COVID-19. And they will be at the core of any future preparedness and response efforts if we do not address and put in place a dramatic shift in our approach. We will be stuck kind of struggling for access to new treatments or new diagnostic technologies or new vaccines, disease by disease, product by product, country by country, company by company, just as we have been for the last 20 years. So, science has really delivered in this crisis. There's no doubt about it, and it has delivered at unprecedented speed. But obviously, the major failure has been around equitable access to the fruits of scientific progress. And so, in our view, if we don't take this opportunity to kind of rebalance or shift the power imbalances that have determined who has a seat at the priority setting and decision-making table. And here, of course, I refer principally to low and middle income country governments, but also civil society, communities, and public health and scientific experts. If we don't take the opportunity to address this lack of transparency and come up with some globally agreed rules about open sharing of knowledge and of data, of intellectual property, of sort of pricing principles and equitable allocation to the poorest, to the most vulnerable, to those who have been on the front lines and will continue to be on the front lines and so are at highest risk. If we don't take this opportunity to do that, we will have absolutely failed in a critical moment, and we don't need to. There is enough knowledge, there is enough learning. We absolutely can kind of turn the tide on this decades-long chronic failure and turn it into a model of sort of collaboration and solidarity that can deliver both innovation and equitable access at the end of the day.
And this is the big picture, ladies and gentlemen, and this is why today's discussion, and thank you very much for joining, is highly relevant and timely in light of also the upcoming discussions of the WHA on the clinical trials resolution. Thank you very much, Benjamin Smith, Glenda Gray, Mateus Falsao, and Rachel Cohen for joining me. Thank you for your time today. Thank you to everyone, and of course, special thanks to our hosts, MSF and its Access campaign for fostering this discussion. Have a nice day or afternoon or evening over for me in Brussels. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yanis.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Nice to see you.
Thank you.